Hey, welcome back to another episode of Studio 118, brought to you by Isaiah 1, verse 18. Come, let us reason, says the Lord. And that's what we're here exactly to do. So I'm Reuben. This is Bunjee. We're here live at Calvary South Austin in Austin, Texas. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. More than likely watching us on YouTube. Thank you for streaming. Or if there's one out there watching on cable access channel 11, God bless you. And we're excited that you're joining us. We have a really good episode lined up for you guys. And first of all, I want to let you know, if you're on YouTube, we do have a live chat. Don't forget, we have a Q&A portion after our discussion. So get your questions in or just say hi. But we have a live chat going. So jump on there and engage in conversation. And also, I do want to let you know, here at Calvary South Austin, we have been meeting in person. We invite you to come check out our services. We meet on Sunday mornings at 9:15 a.m. and 11:15 a.m. and also on Wednesday evenings at 7 p.m. Of course, as we've been mentioning, we've been taking all the necessary safety measures to make sure we're meeting in person, but we're able to do so safely. And even if you're in the high-risk category, we have a separate room where if you need to isolate, we have that for you. We just want to make sure people are safe, but come and join us. Come and be part of the fellowship. Come and be part of the praise and worship and the good Bible study we have going on here. So if you have any questions, you can always call our church for more info. That number is 512-576-5433. Again, that number is 512-576-5433, or you can email the church at info@calvarysouthaustin.com. And speaking of email, I forgot to mention, if you have a question for our Q&A portion and you're watching on Austin Cable Access Channel 11, or you'd rather email or call your question in, you can email us at outreach@calvarysouthaustin.com, or you can also call that same number, 512-576-5433, and someone will queue your question up. And so don't be shy. We're here to engage in really good conversation. We want to be able to present the best arguments for whatever we're talking about, and we are willing to hear all the hard questions, so don't be shy. All right, so I think that gets me out of the announcement stage, and we're going to get into a really juicy topic for you guys. We're going to talk about atheists. Do they exist? Can we believe in atheists? What about all the sightings that we've seen over? I'm kidding. I'm talking about atheism, not aliens. We're talking about atheism. So this is a cool topic. So obviously, as Christians, what business do we have talking about atheism? But I think it is definitely a topic worthwhile. It's worth discussing. We definitely see trends, especially here in America, and we'll talk about that in a bit. But there's an upward trend of people who self-identify as atheists.
Sure.
But I think, first of all, maybe kind of start the discussion, just general thoughts on atheism and what you've seen in your experience and over the years, especially as being a pastor. But then we can get into, what exactly is atheism? Mm-hmm. Because, as we know, terms are changing every day. And so there might be some confusion as to what people actually mean when they use the word atheism.
Right. Well, having kind of dipped my toe in the water of atheism for a season of my life, I was more of an agnostic, and I was a willfully ignorant agnostic. And wow. Being that agnostic, is kind of connected to the term ignoramus,
the Latin term. Yeah,
I was
ignorant.
I was an ignorant ignoramus, and happily so.
That was your nickname?
Yes, that's right.
The band name.
I didn't believe in God until my mid-20s, and for me, I just didn't care. My thought was, if there is a God, then he understands that I'm just a human, and I'm imperfect, and so he either loves me or he doesn't if he exists, right? And so I just went about my life and engaged in my party lifestyle and everything that came along with that, and But I was raised by a mother who was a Christian. I was raised in a Christian home. I was raised up in Sunday school, and I sat there and I sat through it, until she died of cancer, right before my 13th birthday.
Yeah.
And that's when I shook my fist at the sky and said, if this is the kind of God that's out there, the kind of God that would allow my mother who loved Jesus, if this is the kind of God that would allow her to suffer and die of cancer in this sort of way, then that's not the sort of God that I want to believe in, right? And so at that point in time, I just kind of embraced this agnostic, almost atheist. I was a bit of a hard agnostic, I guess, for a season of my life.
Yeah.
And just lived however I wanted to live, all the while thinking that if there is such a God, then, he'll just have to deal with me when I die. And I'm not going to worry about it, right?
Yeah.
And one reason why, again, is because I saw him do nothing for my mom dying of cancer. And, she was the one who was hyper-charismatic, so she believed in the word faith movement. She believed that, you can name and claim your healing. And so therefore, she got her pastor in her church to claim healing over her cancer, didn't go to the hospital, didn't get medical, attention. And then, in God's sovereignty, allowed her to die of cancer. And now as a believer, I recognize that, my mom is completely stoked and enjoying heaven with the Lord. But for that season, just right after her death up until my mid-20s, I went from just being angry with God to just disregarding God to just embracing an ignorant form of agnosticism, because I just didn't care to hear the arguments. It wasn't that I thought you couldn't argue your way to show me, your evidence for God, or that some atheist out there could argue against God, or I just didn't care about any of it. I just wanted to party. And so that's how I lived my life for a season, until that well dried up, and it was just complete emptiness and misery and depression and all those sorts of, depressing, despairing thoughts about, what's life, what's the meaning of life, what's the purpose of being alive, why am I here? If this is all there is, why continue? And I almost got to that nihilistic place where I was just ready to die. I was so tired of life. And
so you were emo.
And I was emo. Yeah, that's right.
You had an emo band.
We did play an emos a few times.
The hair like that.
But yeah. So I just I was done. I was done with the whole concept of God. I just didn't care about. But then, in those final years when I was just, depressed and done with life, I started looking into spiritual answers to the deeper questions. I started looking into the New Age movement, and I started aligning my chakras, and I started practicing, Tai Chi, and I started manipulating the energy around me. And after all was said and done, I was the same jerk that I was, before. I was just as empty in the midst of all of that, right? And so I knew that there was really nothing lasting in any of that.
Yeah.
And thankfully, the Lord sent an evangelist into my life to lead me to see the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And as I began to realize that there's good reason to believe in the God of the Bible, ended up repenting of my sins and trusting in Jesus Christ, and became a born-again believer. Yeah. And then since then, have continued to examine my own faith, examine what the Scriptures say, and then examine other positions like atheism. And so, you brought up earlier on, what business does a Christian have talking about atheism? And I would say we have as much a right to talk about atheism as the atheist has in talking about Christianity, right? And so, we're here tonight to just help our audience to understand that there is no good reason to embrace atheism, and there are actually many good reasons to reject it. Yeah. And so with that, we do have to, we have to spend some time examining, well, what is atheism? What do we mean when we say atheism. And to that I would say, well, classically, atheism has to be understood in the context of theism. Because in its origin, atheism is a proposition that seeks to dismiss theism.
Right.
And so the negative A in front of theism, atheism, is no God. Theism being, God, and the belief in God, and so no God, right? So atheism is no God. That's the classical definition.
Yeah, so it's the negation, right? It is.
Yes.
It is the way I like to put it, because when you start messing with like double negatives and it kind of gets all swirly, and also what I hear when I hear just the general population of atheists using the term, it seems that it's kind of changed a bit, and for reasons maybe we'll get into in a little bit.
You bet.
But classically, as you said, atheism is the positive belief that there is no God. And the reason I would word it that way is because there's implications to that, right? When you say, I positively believe, so if you answer the question, do you believe there's a God? You say no. So there's no God. Correct, right? That the implication there is that now there is a burden of proof.
Right.
Because you've made a positive claim.
Yep.
Even though it has the word not in there. It's still a positive claim that there is no God. Then I can ask, how do you know? What is your evidence?
Sure.
Right? And so that opens up the floodgates of, okay, what for the atheist, what do I need to have in place in order to make this proposition true? And it is a high mountain to climb,
very,
right?
Very high.
And so, yeah, classically speaking, that has been the definition of atheism. But what we've seen, right, is over, I don't know how many years, but it certainly seems like a very recent movement or trend to now start using the term atheism to mean, well, it's, no. I don't know if there's a God or not. I just simply lack a belief in God.
Which really doesn't tie back to the roots of the word itself, atheist, right?
Yep.
When someone says I'm an atheist, what they say is I am without God, or I am a person who says there is no God, or the universe does not have a God, right? That is an atheist.
Yep.
And so you're right. In more modern times, they've lightened their own load.
Yeah.
It's almost as if it's a straw man position that they've set up for themselves, and that might not be the best way to think about it. But it's like they've basically made their burden of proof less than to defend atheism.
Yeah.
Right. So atheism, is the proposition that there is no God, or there are no such beings as gods. But the modern atheist realizes that this straightforward definition of the atheist, which is a theist or no God, right? This can't be defended, and the reason why is because you would have to have all knowledge to be able to make such a massive claim that nowhere in the entire universe or beyond is there a God. To say that there is no God, you have to know that God is not on Venus right now, that God is not in another solar system, that God isn't beyond the universe as we observe it, right? Yep. And this gets into the three spheres of knowledge that I like to bring up when it comes to these sorts of topics, right? So these three spheres of knowledge are the known knows, the known unknowns, and the unknown unknowns, right? So these are the three spheres of knowledge, and we know that all three spheres exist, and the reason why is because, number one, it's obvious, we know that we know some things,
Yep.
right? And then there's also things that we know we don't know enough about. These are the known unknowns, right? But then through scientific discovery and through investigation and observation and these sorts of things, we've discovered things that we didn't even know we didn't know, right? So we know that there has been information that was not available to us at one point, but then we discovered something, and something that was an unknown then slipped into the known unknowns, or has even made its way all the way to the known knows. So within these three spheres of knowledge, you have information that we know, information that we know we don't know enough about, and we're continuing to investigate, and then information that has come from unknown. So how much information is in this arena of the unknown unknowns? And,
I would imagine a whole lot. Yeah.
Well, who knows?
Right.
We don't know that we don't know. So
I think I have a good idea.
you're getting close.
I'm getting close.
I'm doing my best.
Yeah.
But so all of that to set up, does the atheist have enough knowledge? Does the atheist, the one who is embracing a position of no God, does the atheist have the information necessary to make that claim or defend that position, knowing that there is this sphere of information which is filled with unknown unknowns? Is information about God there? Or does God exist in that realm? Or we might think about it like this. The atheist is the one who says everything's matter in motion. It's embracing naturalism, nothing beyond the nature or the natural universe. Well, how do you know? How do you know there's nothing beyond nature? How do you know that there's nothing beyond the matter of our universe?
Yeah.
You would have to have all knowledge to be able to say that there is no God beyond the matter of this universe, right? There is no atheist that has this level of information. And listen, the atheist who actually possesses all knowledge to be able to say, I am truly an atheist, that atheist would have to be the very God they're denying.
Right. To be all knowledgeable, right?
If you're all-knowing, that is one of God's attributes. So if you can actually defend the claim there is no God, then it would be self-defeating, because you would be the very God that you're claiming doesn't exist.
I'm sure there's a movie about that. I'd love to watch it. So yeah, we're talking about this very steep mountain of burden of proof that was once upon, or still is upon, every atheist. But what we've seen is a shifting of the goalpost, so to speak, right? A redefinition.
They've lightened their load.
Yes, they've lightened the load by now saying, no, it's not that I believe there's no God. It's more, I lack that belief, and I live my life, and usually it's couched in terms of really I lack a belief, or the evidence that's out there just hasn't convinced me, right? And we'll get into, well, okay, what is the evidence, and is it really insurmountable, right?
Which is interesting, because they've moved from an etymological definition of atheism, and they've shifted it more towards a metaphysical take on it. Rather than just resting in the etymology of the word atheist, they're sliding it out and saying, okay, no, I want to be a metaphysical atheist, so to speak. Right? My proposition is not based in my attack on theism, but rather I'm going to sit back over here and call you out to prove to me that a God exists.
Right, and that is exactly the tactic, the strategy behind all of this, from what I see, is they've lightened the load. Essentially, they have no burden of proof.
Right.
I'm not making a claim. I just lack a belief. How can you fault me for that? You're the one coming to me and telling me there is a God. Prove it.
Yeah, which in my estimation, this is more hard agnosticism than it is atheism, and what they're doing is what Dr. Greg Bahnsen called the fallacy of pretended neutrality. Right. So this fallacy of pretended neutrality is, hey, I'm just here, I'm not taking a position, right? But if you think that there is a God, prove it to me. But until you prove it to me, I'm just going to be neutral. I'm not going to tell you that there is no God, but I also don't believe that there's enough evidence to believe in a God. So I'm just neutral. I'm a neutral party. I'm Switzerland. I'm not part of the battle. And under the guise of pretended neutrality, I'm going to attack theism.
Right.
by showing you that all your arguments for God are insufficient to convince me to become a theist.
Yep.
But they're not neutral. They're not neutral at all. If they were, then they'd at least be intellectually honest enough to say, okay, I'm not an atheist. I can't prove there is no God. I just don't believe in a God, and I don't think that you can convince me of a God. And what is that? That's a hard agnostic, not an atheist.
Yeah, so I see two, possible responses here, right? For the Christian there who is coming across an atheist that, let's say they go with I just lack a belief, right? To that, I think the easiest response is really, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, where, well, you're not really stating anything that is falsifiable. You're not really telling me anything about the reality that we live in.
Right.
What you're really just telling me is about your psychological state. So the sentence, I just lack a belief. Well, a whole bunch of things lack a belief. These chairs in front of us, this table, it lacks a belief.
They're all atheists.
Right? This microphone lacks atheist microphones. I don't know where we got these from. We got to get in touch with our sponsors here. We have no sponsors. But that's what it boils down to, is if you lack a belief, you're not telling me anything about the nature of reality.
Right.
You're just telling me the state of your mind, really. And that really says nothing. It's more of a meaningless statement. But now when it comes to, well, the evidence that you've presented me has not done enough to convince me. Well, if we're going to be a little bit technical here, right, we got to parse that and say, the evidence is there. What you're talking about more is whether or not you're persuaded by it. That's a whole different problem.
Right.
If I've presented evidence, so the atheist really can't say that there is no evidence. Really what it's coming down to is, you've presented evidence. I'm just not convinced. So that's a whole different set of problems, and we can talk about that. But
yeah, like let's say there was arguments about let's just pick a topic like voter fraud, and that evidence
Canceled.
was sent to a court. Let's say that the evidence was put forward to a court, and the court simply dismissed the evidence without actually looking at it, right? That's kind of what we're talking about here, right? If I were to sit down with an atheist and say, hey, here's all this evidence, right? Laws of logic, uniformity, of nature. We see, evidence of design, and go on and on and on, and not all the way to, the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And they go, yeah, I'm not even going to consider any of that, right? Mm-hmm. Why? Because I'm an atheist, and I don't believe that you have any argument that will convince me, right?
So as you said, that's a hard agnosticism, right?
That, in my opinion, that's a hard agnostic, right? Because they're unwilling to say there is no God, which is etymologically an atheist. Right. So if you're not going to embrace the etymology of the very word that you're using to describe your belief system or lack thereof, then what you really are is an agnostic. You're saying that you don't have any knowledge to believe in a God. And you can call it, well, I don't have a belief in God. But at the end of the day, what you're really looking for is knowledge to change your mind. So if you don't have the knowledge to believe in a God, that is agnosticism. That you are an agnostic. You are lacking the information to believe in a God. And then a hard agnostic is someone who comes along and says, I don't have enough information to think that there is a God, and I don't think you have the information either, so therefore I'm not going to listen to you either. Yeah,
it's a moot
point.
It's
a moot.
Moot.
You don't have standing.
Yeah. So we've introduced these terms, right? So atheism, hard agnosticism. If there's a hard agnosticism, there's got to be a weak agnosticism.
Yeah.
And from my understanding, right, this sort of agnostic person who takes this position is more saying, well, I don't know if there's a God, but I'm open. I'm open to the evidence.
And I tend to use the word strong and soft.
There you go. Yep.
And so the soft agnostic is someone who says, well, I've never really seen anything to convince me. There's no information or data that has convinced me that there is a God, but I'm open to any arguments that you can present me with. And it's always a pleasure to talk to a soft agnostic because, you know, they're open to the conversation, and
they're squishy.
It tends to be it tends to be meaningful, you know, and just in the sense that, you know, I always appreciate someone who's just open to information. Doesn't mean they need to walk away and agree with me, or you know, but someone that'll just sit there and consider, you know, the points that that I've thought through or that you've thought through, to actually have a meaningful conversation about why I believe what I believe or why they believe what they believe. I always enjoy, you know, engaging in conversation with those.
Are you saying that still happens today?
You know, every now and again, you know, as long as you don't trigger them.
Man, wow. I haven't heard of a successful conversation like that in years.
You know, it's
about 4 or 5 years or so. Yeah. Wow, it's been crazy.
It's getting harder.
So that's another good point there, is that this distinction. So hopefully, you know, we're not just introducing terms for the sake of, you know, showing off or anything, but, you know, it's cool. What we're doing is trying to show you, the audience, that there are distinctions that agnostics and atheists out there will take. And I think it would be helpful if you ever find yourself in a conversation with such a person, ask them, well, would you consider yourself an atheist in the classical sense, or are you more of a hard agnostic, or as we said, soft and weak agnostic, or hard and weak agnosticism? Ask them where they fall on that spectrum, and that'll kind of give you a flavor for, oh, okay, this is kind of where they're leaning. But in general, just ask questions about that, about their beliefs. And I think a favorite question would just be, just get to the nuts and bolts of it and say, do you agree with this proposition? There is a God. Or is this true? There is a God. And that really gets down to the meat of it. If they say no, then that's the classical definition of atheism. And then you have grounds for asking them, what is your reason for believing that is false? So again, if you ever come across Christian, I'm speaking to the Christian obviously, come across a person who's pulling the position of, well, I just lack a belief, or I'm not convinced by the evidence. What's really happening here is that they're trying to relieve themselves of the burden that is upon the atheist. But ultimately, I think we all have that burden. Once we start making claims that, no, this is false, or this is true, you have a burden of proof upon you. So even if the agnostic says, I don't agree, or I'm not persuaded by your evidence, I would ask them, so you believe my evidence is false? Yes. Okay, show me why. What are your reasons, right? So there's still a burden of proof. They've not escaped it entirely, but what they've done is try to kind of shift it as far back as they can to avoid that burden of proof. So hopefully that helps you out in figuring out what is the actual definition of atheism that we're working with here. And one thing I did want to add also is that, I mean, like we said, classically speaking, you can definitely look up definitions of atheism, and the classical definitions are still there. I'm looking at the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which is a very well-known, trusted encyclopedia for terms like this. And atheism, it says it's typically defined in terms of theism. It is best understood as a proposition, something that is either true or false. And it does get into the sort of shifting of the goalpost that has happened is recent, but it clearly says here that the classic definition has the added virtue of making atheism a direct answer to one of those metaphysical questions, which is there a God? So when you try to say, I just lack a belief, you definitely know they're trying to shift away from answering the direct question. So hopefully that helps out there.
And again, a lack of belief in God is based on a lack of information. You haven't received enough information to believe in a God. That's agnosticism.
Yeah.
That's not atheism. Atheism is in response to theism. The theist says there is a God, and in response, the atheist gives the negative argument, the negative position, no, there is no God. And now we have a debate. To slide back from that and say, well, I just don't have a belief in God. Well, you're an agnostic then. Yeah. Don't call yourself an atheist. You know, I remember going to one of the atheist meetings here in town many years ago, and I found out that a teacher at one of the high schools here in town, I was actually the youth pastor at Calvary Austin at this point in time, and my student, one of my kids in my Sunday school class, kept coming to me with things that his science, his biology, teacher had presented him with, and I kept saying, ask your teacher to invite me into the class. I'd love to debate him in front of everybody. And, he kept on, the teacher kept on making excuses for why he wasn't going to allow for that. And then I found out that this teacher was speaking at one of the atheist meetings here in town, which was taking place at, one of the Lubies in their meeting hall. And I said, okay, great. Let's grab our youth group and we'll head over there and, we'll sit in on this meeting. And so a bunch of us went to Lubies for that atheist meeting, and I began to engage, the leader there as well as the teacher who was there as the guest speaker. And, by the end of it, I basically brought them to what is the definition of atheism and who here embraces the classical versus the more modern. And boom, it erupted. That basically you had the old school, classical atheists arguing with the new school, modern atheists who are really nothing more than agnostics. And in the midst of this argumentation, I finally one of them just said, look, it's not like we're a religion. And
you look around.
And I said, well, it is Sunday, and you guys are meeting, and you did take up a collection when I first got here, so you did pass a plate, and you've already beat the Baptists to Lubies, so it sure does seem like a religion to me.
Yeah.
But within this group of atheists here in Austin, Texas, they could not agree upon what the definition of atheism is.
So now there's a schism.
Well, most
the
certainly.
Reformed atheists versus
exactly. So which comes back to your point, which is when you're engaging someone who claims to be an atheist, you need to look further. You need to drill down into that and ask them what it is they actually believe. Right? What do you mean by atheist? Because you just can't take it for granted anymore. Chances are you're talking to a hard agnostic, but it's possible that you might be talking to a classical atheist. If it's a classical atheist, it's real easy to just say, you don't have all knowledge, therefore you can't make the proposition, there is no God. Yep. And then that slides them into the agnostic camp. Okay, well, I just don't have enough information to believe in God. Okay, you're an agnostic. Can we take you from a hard agnostic to a soft agnostic? Are you willing to listen to the evidence that I can present you with? Yep. And then you'll see whether they're open to that or not.
Right. Yeah, very, very good points to bring up there in conversation. And so that, let me just take a break here and just remind you guys, you're watching Studio 118. We're streaming live here from Calvary South Austin. I do want to let you know that we are meeting in person here on Sunday mornings and on Wednesday evenings. Sunday mornings at 9:15 a.m. and 11:15 a.m. and on Wednesday evenings at 7 p.m. If you have any information about our services here, feel free to call our church at 512-576-5433. But we're here at Studio 118. We're talking about the topic of atheism, and we've just been talking about the definition of atheism. It's a really good discussion so far. Don't forget, we are streaming live on YouTube. There's a live chat going on. We have a Q&A after our discussion. We'd love to hear your questions. So engage there on the live chat. Submit your questions. You can also email them to outreach@calvarysouthaustin.com, or again, call the church and they'll queue your question up. Call at 512-576-5433. All right, so talking about the definition of atheism, and then, that should lead us now, okay, is there really any point? Like, is atheism really a threat? Is atheism, are atheists really kind of posing a threat to the church? Is this something we really need to be concerned about? What's some information we have on atheism today, right?
Yeah.
And so,
good question.
I was looking this up, and I noticed a few surveys that were put out by Pew Research Center and also Barna, and there's some interesting stuff to know about atheism. And as I mentioned at the outset of this episode, I mentioned that there is an upward trend. So let me jot off some of the information we have on atheism today. So, for instance, in the Pew Research Center, they conducted a phone survey here in 2019, and they found that about 4% of American adults, this is just strictly speaking U.S., 4% of American adults say they are atheists. Now, 4% might seem kind of low, right? But that is actually double So up from 2% back in 2009. So there is an upward trend there. Also, speaking globally, in Western Europe, there were 15 countries that were surveyed in 2017. It's very recent. It's even greater amounts of atheists in those areas. So, for instance, in Belgium, 1 in 5, nearly 20% of Belgians identify as atheists. And 16% of adults in Denmark identify as atheists, 15% in France, and 14% in the Netherlands and Sweden. So I think that's 3 or 4 times as many as atheists as there are in the U.S. So there's definitely a good share of people who identify as atheists today. What about, and this is something I've been hearing about a lot also, is Gen Z, the new generation, the generation that are about teenage age right now. They call them Gen Z. Before that, there are the millennials. And then there were Gen Y, I think, or were they the boomers, right? But Gen Z, the percentage of teens who identify are double that of the general population. So around 13% of Gen Zers would identify as atheists. So these are our teenagers that we see running around, right? And what are their reasons for doing that? So if you're a parent out there and you're concerned, oh man, what does my child believe? Gen Zers, 13% of Gen Zers, compare that to the general population of atheists, they identify as atheists. Or again, remember, we're talking about atheism, not agnosticism. They're actually saying, I identify as an atheist. And that was a Barna survey that was done. There was a neat quote that I saw regarding this trend among Gen Zers. It says, the new atheists argue that God doesn't exist. So this is the new atheists that were back in kind of like the early 2000s. But now atheism 2.0 among Gen Zers, they simply assume that God doesn't exist. So imagine how much culture has shifted. What would have to happen in culture for the new generation, the up-and-coming generation, Gen Zers, to instead argue their way to atheism? Now they simply assume by default that atheism is true. So that is eye-opening, to say the least, and just kind of lets us know that, especially as Christians, as the church, we need to be doing a better job. We need to step up to the plate and address these questions. It's one thing to see a 4% number and say, well, I mean, I guess it's low on my priority list. I'll get to it if I ever come across an atheist. But especially among our younger population, they see less and less reason to stay in church. They see less and less reason to even open up the Bible or even take instruction on religious doctrine. So it's very eye-opening for the church, and this is why we are putting episodes like this on, to address a lot of these claims that, in the end, I think you'll see that they're easily addressed. A lot of them really come down to arguments of, I don't really like that it's this way, rather than really serious arguments that get down into philosophy and theology. So hopefully that comes across.
And it's sad that one reason for this is just due to the fact that Christians have become apathetic and are more interested in being entertained and are more interested in what the latest music is, and can I smoke cigars and drink pints with my pastor, and and these sorts of things. Like that's more important to many Christians today. These secondary, tertiary issues. I've even seen some Christians who are more concerned about where their pet is going in the afterlife than their neighbor. It makes no sense to me.
Yep.
And so, coming back to like why does this matter? Like, why does it matter that atheism is increasing here in America, right? Well, at the end of the day, if Christianity is false, then it doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. Right? If the Bible's not true, if Jesus didn't rise from the grave, then it doesn't really matter. If you want to be a Christian, be a Christian. If that makes you feel good, if you want to be, whatever else, you want to be an atheist, be an atheist. So it doesn't matter. At the end of the day, we're all just worm dirt, and so whatever makes you happy in this life, go for it, right? But if Christianity is true, if Jesus is risen from the grave, then what this also means is that he is going to stand in judgment over everyone who rejected him. And he is going to condemn to eternal torment those who rejected his free gift of forgiveness. Now, if that's the reality, then it's a huge problem. Because as I consider like the 13% of that specific age group known as, Gen Z, 13% of Gen Z is already just, on their way to hell because Christians are no longer really invested in evangelizing our community. It's staggering to consider it. And while the atheist doesn't believe the Bible is true, Christians should. And we ought to be moved with compassion to recognize that if we don't reach the unbelievers here in our nation and around the world, if we don't reach them with the gospel, then they're going to stand before our Savior one day, and he's going to act as their judge, and he will judge them according to every single sin they've ever committed. So if you're an atheist, watching right now, or you're a hard agnostic or a soft agnostic or whatever it is, I hope that you'll at least understand that, we actually do believe the Bible. We actually do believe that there is a judgment day that's coming. And we actually do believe that Jesus is going to judge and condemn every sinner that would not repent and trust in him. Because listen, on the cross, that's where Jesus satisfied the righteous wrath and the judicial requirements of God the Father. He took the punishment that we deserve so that we could receive the forgiveness that we don't deserve. And the person that rejects Jesus Christ is simultaneously rejecting that forgiveness. And those who reject the forgiveness of Jesus Christ are rejecting the atonement that he accomplished on the cross when he took our punishment. So being that God the Father has to punish every single sin, he's given us two options. One, you can allow Jesus to receive your punishment there on the cross. Or two, you can receive your own punishment for all of your sins in eternity there in hell. We actually believe this, and we're concerned for those who are rejecting Jesus Christ, which is why we would engage in a conversation about atheism, not because we just want to pick on atheists, but rather because we're concerned for all these people who are rejecting Jesus Christ, because we do believe that there is coming a day when Jesus will judge every unbeliever for their sins. So as we see this increasing number of atheists, it's very concerning to me because I know what the Bible says about how they're going to spend eternity. And I would spare them of that as much as God the Father would want to spare them of that as well, which is why he sent Jesus.
Yeah. And, not only does the church need to step up, right, but obviously the church is made up of individuals and their family units. And we do need to also encourage our family units that's where it starts. The rearing of children, teaching them the doctrine that we've learned, the truths that are found in Scripture. And what's the verse? Is train up the child in the way they should go, and when they're older, they will not depart from it. Some see that as a promise. Some see it as we still have kids that rebel and never come back, like prodigal children, right?
Sure.
But the point is that even the New Testament in Romans, I believe it says that it is the kindness of God that leads to repentance.
Right.
And so when the parents are modeling that for their children, I'm a parent of a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old, and don't get me wrong, it's super difficult to raise children. I mean, you see the bags under my eyes, you see that? They're forever there now. Point is, though, I get it, it's difficult, but there are promises found in Scripture that if you engage in the tough work now of rearing your children and instructing them in the ways that are found in Scripture, when they're older, they're not going to forget that.
Yeah.
And it's more likely that they will follow in your footsteps and repent and believe in the gospel message, right?
Yeah.
And my point is with all that is that with Gen Z here, 13%, that tells me that there is a failure beginning at the household. And I don't say that lightly, right? I don't say that to disparage again, I get it. Parenting is super difficult. But I think we all need to come together. The church needs to surround these families and encourage them in ways and provide opportunities for them and their children to learn more about the truths not only found in Scripture, but a lot of the arguments that we're going to talk about tonight.
I feel like you're getting ready to plug youth camp.
Yes. Not only that, but so we do have youth camp where we get away for 1 week, right? And this is our largest outreach event that we have for this church, where we get to have our junior hires and our high schoolers get out for 1 week and just spend time fellowshipping, but also learning the truths found in Scripture.
Yes.
And providing opportunities for them to have hard discussions, deep discussions that they might not otherwise have with their parents.
Right.
And so that's a very good outlet. So if that's something you're interested in, call our church. Also, that's one of the reasons I do believe that we are also in the midst of planning a school, right? We want to provide that educational outlet. If it begins in the household, education is part of that.
Right.
And so now these are just a couple of examples, but ultimately it definitely starts with that one-on-one relationship at the household, the parent pouring into the child, modeling it day after day, all the flaws born out of that, but they see that even with those flaws, man, my parents, they love Jesus and they love others, and I want that. Because
Right.
we see that. We can talk about it a little bit later, right? There's this innate understanding of what is right and what is wrong. There's this innate desire for these bigger things. And where does that come from?
Right.
So we'll definitely get into that.
Yeah.
So, yeah, why don't we jump into that? So we've talked about definition. We've talked about, what are some of the current stats on atheism. But now let's get down to the nitty-gritty, right? Let's talk about the nitty-gritty. If atheism is true, right, and we're talking about the classical definition, if it is true that there is no God, what would the world look like? Or what would we expect if atheism were true? And does that line up with what we actually see in the world today?
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that immediately pops up in my mind is the issue of morality. That's one of my just go-to, okay, you got to answer this question. What does morality look like under atheism?
Mm-hmm.
And the way I see it is morality dealing with, obviously, the things that are right and wrong, okay? And moral values, things that are right and wrong, and moral duties. What's my motivation for even doing right versus wrong? What does that look like if there is no God? And even before I jump into that, I do want at the outset to kind of debunk, if you will, that common claim, well, just because I don't believe in God doesn't mean that I'm going to turn into a mass murderer. And that's always the way it's put, just because I don't believe in God. Well, I hope you understand the distinction. We're not talking about a belief, what you believe. We're talking about whether or not atheism is true. What are the implications? If there is no God, if God does not exist, what is the implication? That's what we're talking about.
And I think I've heard it oftentimes where an atheist will insist that, atheists can be just as moral as Christians.
Mm-hmm.
And some even take it further, and we'll talk about Hitchens in a little while,
Yep.
But some will take it further to say that, a lot of times atheists are more moral than Christians. And that might be the case. We'd have to look at each individual and compare atheist to Christian, down the columns, and
Yeah.
Maybe that would turn out to be the case, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the point that I think you're going to be making here is not that all atheists are immoral,
Right.
but rather, do atheists have a basis for absolute laws of morality,
Yeah.
or universal laws of morality?
Yeah.
How would an atheist justify a universal law of morality? For example, I'm guessing that wherever we go in the universe, it's always wrong to abuse children.
I would hope so.
Why? Why? On atheism, if atheism is true, why? Why is that a universal moral law?
So that gets into, what are we implying then? What are we saying then? If there is no God, what falls out of place? What is missing at that point?
And then taking it out a little bit further, if there is, because, in atheism, if atheism is true, then what a society embraces is just a convention of that group, right? So then if one convention says it's wrong to gas people of a certain race and engage in genocide. Mm-hmm. So this group over here says, no. We as a society have a conventional belief that it's immoral to engage in genocide. This society over here has a different convention. They say, you know what? We're tired of the Jews. Let's gas them all, right? Now, if atheism is true, why would this society or these groups, these societies, this group of nations, why would they think that they have the moral high ground to come and stop this group from from accomplishing, this Holocaust?
Yeah.
What gives this group the moral high ground to think that their convention is right and their convention is wrong?
Because they have more people.
Because they have a greater convention.
Or they're more powerful. Could that not be an answer?
So another issue. Let's look back at slavery here in America, mm-hmm. when it was the law of the land. Mm-hmm. If the majority of society said it was moral to own slaves, if the convention says it's okay, was it okay then? And what gives us the right at this point in time to look back at that period and say, oh, they were all wrong, they were all immoral? Well, of course we would say they were immoral for owning slaves. Of course.
Yeah.
Right? But if atheism is true, and the convention was that the majority of people believed that owning slaves was A-okay, well, if atheism's morality is based on conventional wisdom, then if the convention says it's okay, it's okay.
Can we take a step back here and explain why are we framing it that way, right? Why do we automatically assume that it's conventional, right? And if I could just start to take a stab and we can go back and forth. The reasoning, I think the thinking is like this. If there is no God, we have removed any mention of supernatural. There is no, it's just material, right? That's where we have materialism now.
Matter in motion.
Matter in motion, right? All that exists is whatever's inside the universe, just atoms. And the story goes then that these atoms came together to form worlds, and ultimately on one little marble, other things, life forms formed over whatever time. And these life forms were separated into different groups, and until relatively recent, you had this group called Homo sapiens, and they seem to have evolved. So evolution's the name of the game, right? No purpose, no rhyme or reason. It's really just survival of the fittest, natural selection, and we've made it to 2021.
Barely,
yes. We're struggling. We might not make it. So, but it's just matter in motion, like you said. There is really no overarching governance. There's no standard that exists outside of matter. It really is just this life form, this squishy robot really, is determined in a sense. Whatever physical attributes they have, whatever decisions they seem to be making, it really is just the product of a bunch of several events that came before them and is causing them to act in a certain way. They have been able to form groups, what we call countries and communities, mm-hmm. and they've been able to somehow develop language and come up with standards of living, and they said for now, well, we just want to help our Homo sapien race, or whatever you want to call it, flourish.
Right.
And in the meantime, like as you mentioned, at some point, slavery was the law of the land. The convention said, slavery is now the law of the land. Slavery is good. Slavery is legal. And people fought against it, and they were able to convince enough people to change the law. But for that small time, it was legal.
That's right.
It was okay. And that's where we're coming from. That's the thinking, is that if materialism, if it's just matter in motion, there's no standard of reference outside of that. It really is just causal determinism at that point. And so how can you not say, under atheism, anything is right or wrong?
And to carry this out a little bit further, to grasp why moral conventions don't really make sense in the big scheme of things if atheism is true. Well, it's because it kind of flies in the face of natural selection. So if natural selection is the law of the land, and that's how we arrived here, through this process of natural selection from goo to you by way of the zoo, if that's the case, then the best thing that we can do is to not get in the way of natural selection. And what's connected to natural selection but the strong will survive? Mm-hmm. And yet we have a society of people who are quick to protect the weak, quick to protect the vulnerable. You've got a society of people who are up in arms right now because Governor Greg Abbott just decided to lift the mask law, and now everybody's like, oh, if you're not going to wear a mask, then you're trying to kill grandma. Well, if natural selection is the law of the land and the strong will survive, why aren't we making the argument that, well, whoever doesn't survive COVID, they were too weak to survive it anyway, therefore just let the weak die so that those who survive COVID will pass on those COVID surviving genes to the next generation, and therefore we as a people are stronger, and that is going to guarantee the flourishing of Homo sapiens, right? Nobody's making that argument. I have not heard one atheist make that argument.
There have been in the past, Margaret Sanger, right?
Margaret Sanger, sure.
Eugenics.
Sure. But as of today, since the pandemic began, I have not heard one atheist take a stand on atheism and say, let natural selection rule, drop your masks, let's have some COVID parties, and whoever survives, and they will be the stronger genes that carries on the human race, and we will be over COVID, within 20 years.
Yeah.
No one's making that argument. And yet, that would follow from atheism. Mm-hmm. So why is it that we're not really seeing a morality that lines up with what we would expect out of atheism? Yeah. Which is, ultimately, I'm going to spread my seed, and I'm going to take from you if I can, because ultimately it's about my survival.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, I get it. So again, that's the fundamental question. Does reality line up with what we would expect if atheism were true? And unfortunately, I don't know, depending on what perspective you take, but if you're the atheist, the moment you start making an argument for a certain thing is right, objectively right or objectively wrong, at that very moment, you have to understand you are now smuggling from a different worldview.
Most certainly.
If atheism is true and materialism is the name of the game, it's just matter in motion. It's just really squishy robots fizzing differently. Brain, synapses are firing off in different ways, and they have been determined up until that point. There is no way to tell whether one is morally right or morally wrong. It's just different.
Yeah.
So when you see the little old lady getting punched, or you see whatever atrocities, right? We have definitely seen major atrocities happen in our lifetimes. If you need to be consistent, if you're going to stay consistent, you have to say that I don't like it personally, but I can't say that it was wrong. And I've definitely met atheists who take that position.
Oh, yeah.
Which is
I've talked to them too. It is.
Yeah, I remember talking with one guy at the campus, right? And he had his girlfriend next to him. And I asked him that question. If there was a group of guys that came here and were trying to take your girlfriend out, would you say that's wrong? They're trying to, violate her and all that? He says, well, I really can't say that it's wrong in the end. I literally just turned and looked at her. You heard that, right? You need to be careful with this guy, essentially. But he's trying to be consistent, which I give him credit for, but these are the types of scenarios that you have to be ready for. But reality doesn't match up with that. As Bunjee mentioned, we find ourselves acting against our own self-interest every single day. Every single day. We are making decisions that would put us in that category of the weakest. But yet we applaud that in society.
I was down at the University of Texas talking to a group of atheists that were representing their club on campus, at their table, and I began to engage them in questions about morality and ultimately ask them, is there any ultimate moral law that we could use to show that that Hitler's Holocaust was immoral if the convention was in agreement. And they didn't like the Holocaust, so good on them for that.
Yes.
They thought the Holocaust was a horrible thing.
Yes.
But they had no basis for saying that that the convention was wrong. Mm-hmm. Because if that's what the convention believed, that's what they believed.
Yeah.
And who can argue against the convention?
Yes. Now, what about, I think we've touched on this before, but okay, let's say convention, we don't really believe in a convention. It's more about utilitarianism.
Sure.
What is going to provide the best outcome for the greatest amount of people? Mm-hmm. And I've definitely heard this being espoused, by random atheists or agnostics. It's really not a convention. It's really what is going to provide the best outcome for the greatest amount. This is utilitarianism.
Right.
How can we use people to be utilities to arrive at the best outcome?
Right. And so one of the ways to approach this is, well, what if theism is the most utilitarian approach at arriving at the best possible outcome?
Mm-hmm. Valid question. Yeah.
Would they embrace theism at that point in time?
Would they embrace it?
Because I've applied the same argument with the conventional argument, right? Mm-hmm. Which basically goes something to this effect that more than 90% of people believe in a God, regardless of which God they believe in. Mm-hmm. More than 90%. I think where are we at? About 10% with atheists right now. Mm. But let's say that there's 90% theists, 10% atheists, right? So the convention says it's better to believe in a God. And you can go and pick and choose which God that you want to believe in. But as far as theism versus atheism, the convention says there's a God. But they don't want that convention. They don't want conventional truth. So yeah, they would maybe embrace utilitarianism. But then that gets into an oughtness position, right? So what is better than what is now? How do we determine that? Mm-hmm. What is the moral standard to say, well, the way that we ought to be is, when we backing up and talking about slavery again, there was a bunch of people who thought, we ought to work less, and so let's go find some slaves. Mm-hmm. And that will be better for this society, right? And this has been going on in the history of the world. There are still places in Africa where people enslave other people mm-hmm. because they think that this will help them to flourish as a society, right? So when it comes to utilitarianism, well, better for which group, better for which society, better for which people, if there's this utopia that you're pushing towards and you're trying to achieve, so that more people flourish in more ways, who's going to define all of that? Yeah. And based on what moral standard are you going to head in a certain direction? And then that brings us back again to the, there's a way society ought to be for our flourishing. Well, based on what standard? Mm-hmm. If it's worst to best, then there's a standard there. Who gets to determine that?
Yeah, it has, and it can't change, right? Because if it were shifting all the time, day to day, then what was best at one point could be the worst the next, and your position would have to change each day, right? So we'd need a standard that is not changing, and it clearly can't come from us because culture's changing every single day, right?
Exactly
The
right.
mores of society are changing every single day.
Yep.
And that's where it's pointing to. It has to exist outside of society.
Yes.
It has to be above us and unchanging. And this is definitely not what atheism is proposing. It's just really materialism.
So if atheism is true, then there is no basis for a universal moral law.
Right.
Not to say that atheists can't be moral or that they aren't moral. I know a lot of atheists, and most of them are outstanding citizens, wonderful people. Mm-hmm. But why? Why would they behave in those ways? And without any universal reason to do that. And I think that Paul, gives us an understanding of why that is. It's in Romans chapter 2. He talks about the Gentiles, and in that context, he's talking about unbelievers. The unbelievers who do not have the law by nature do the things in the law. These also, not having the law, are a law to themselves, who show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness, and between themselves their thoughts accusing or else excusing them. And so basically what Paul is saying here is that those who they weren't given the Old Testament law, they weren't given the Mosaic law, they're outside of the Jewish faith, right? They didn't grow up learning the Mosaic law. They didn't receive the 613 Old Testament laws, and yet they're doing things that line up with that law, or they have convictions that reflect what we find in the Mosaic law. And what Paul is saying here is that, because the law is written on their hearts. Mm-hmm. Now, I think most atheists would embrace the idea better known as tabula rasa, or that we're born a blank slate, and then it becomes that we just experience things, or we're imprinted by the society that we find ourselves in with a specific belief system that either the convention or utilitarianism has come up with, right? And so this is where people just experience. The standards that they're basically
society puts on them, or the parents.
That you're raised by your group and embrace the beliefs and the standards of the group, right? And Paul's saying, no, you're not born a blank slate. And he's saying that the law of God is actually etched into your heart. It's written upon your heart. The Mosaic law God has placed on your heart. And that's why you see atheists who don't have the faith to believe in a God still having similar convictions mm-hmm. to Christians who believe that the law is a good standard, for how we ought to live. Why is it that we both basically agree with the same concepts of morality?
Yeah.
Because if evolution is the law of the land, if we simply evolved, from ape-like ancestors, and if the strong will survive, and this really is what is inbred into us, then these forms of morality that so many around the world, and I would say everyone around the world, naturally leans towards, I think it would be a different set of moral rules. I think that I can't see where stealing would necessarily be a wrong thing mm-hmm. if there is no God. I mean, why is stealing wrong if there is no God?
Right.
Right? If you have something that I want and I have the strength to take it, well, if there is no God, then why? Why not? I mean, we see that in the animal kingdom. Mm-hmm. When you look at, hey, this silverback wants to be in power, and that silverback is in power, and so there's a fight to the death. Well, why isn't this the way we run our presidential elections?
We used to.
Let's get back to that. That would be much more fun.
Easier.
But seriously, like, if we pull from our past, if evolution is true and there is no God, and the strong will survive, why aren't we just looking for the strongest silverback, to come and just crush the last president, toss him out of the way, and lead the nation with that kind of strength? Why wouldn't it be like that? That's what I would expect if atheism were true.
Right.
But we engage in politics. We engage in an attempt to be just and fair and equitable, and all of these things are valuable to us. Why? Well, we go to the God of the Bible and we say, oh, he's equitable, he's just, he's fair, he's a God of order. And so all of these things are just reflective of the God that created us. Whereas if atheism were true, we shouldn't expect the moral society that I think that most people try to achieve. We shouldn't expect that we would have any real purpose in life. Like when I was doing my own thing, when I was the ignoramus.
Yep.
I came to the place of what's the point of living. Like I came to that time of nihilistic angst in my heart. Of if this is all it is, if this is life in its total, if I've experienced all the best things and I'm just going to get old now and start falling apart, and if that's all that's in front of me right now, what's the point in living one more day? To me, that's reflective of what really ought to be happening in the heart of every person if atheism is actually true.
Devoid of meaning.
There's no meaning.
Purpose. Yep.
There's no real purpose. There's no real point in living. And so the minute my heart's broken, the minute I'm disappointed, the minute things aren't going my way, why not just end it?
Yeah.
And it's sad that there are many people taking that path, and we've seen that more and more since the lockdowns and with this whole pandemic. You just see people who, they already had zero purpose, and now you've taken away from them, being able to be sociable and being able to connect with others, and you take that away, and next thing you know, it's just kind of like, well, if I'm going to sit in my house all day long, then I'm going to start doing heroin, and next thing you know, they're overdosing.
Yeah.
It's tragic, but it is the fruit of atheism.
That's definitely what we would expect. And I've heard responses to this about whether there's overarching meaning and purpose. And the way I've heard it phrased from an atheist would be, well, even though there's no global or cosmic purpose to this life, I make my own purpose. Every time I wake up and, every time I put on my shoes and go to my job and hang out with friends, I'm making the most of my life today, and that's what brings me purpose.
Sure.
And, to that, I immediately think that, well, number one, you have to deal with those hard cases of, okay, there's a certain amount of people in this world that are psychopaths. They really cannot process emotions, right? But what they do find, they find joy in a lot of times in wicked things. That's their purpose. That's what they get up and enjoy doing. They've found their day-to-day purpose. Can you, with your own purpose, can you point at them and say, oh, no, but that's not the purpose that's right for them? Well, there's no cosmic purpose. Remember what you said, that they're trying to make oughts out of what is. They're trying to say, just because it's true for me, it needs to be true for everybody else. No, not under atheism.
Right.
There's no such thing. On a global scale, we shouldn't be seeing everybody sharing the common moral codes, the common belief that there is this progression that we should be making. There's common purpose, right? We should all be flourishing as a human society. As an atheist, they've already admitted, no, there's no cosmic purpose. I make it myself every day. Oh, but that psychopath over there, or that person doing wicked things, okay, I'm stuck here. I want to say that they're wrong, but oh, man, that's their purpose. That's what they enjoy doing. So hopefully they kind of, wrestle with that and understand that that's pointing to the fact that there is cosmic purpose. The reason I can say that this person is following their life and going, draining their life or throwing it away, basically, because I understand from the God of the Bible that he has created this world with design and order, and ultimately there is an end goal in sight, which is to know him and be with him forever. And so if you're living your life in such a way that is not oriented towards doing that, I can say you're not living out your purpose. So that's something else that the atheist would definitely need to wrestle with.
And then, what about justice if everything is just material matter in motion? How can you really condemn someone who is only doing what their biology determined them to do? Right? We see this argument, popping up now with transgenderism, and well, if they are what they are, they might be born, with this sex, but does that mean that this is their gender, and these sorts of questions, right? And if they feel like if they have male parts, but they feel like a woman inside, then who can deny what their biology is doing, what their matter, what the fizzy robot concept, it's like, well, if that's what's happening in their body, who can say that they're wrong, right? But then, are we going to then turn around and say the same thing about the pedophile or the murderer? Why don't we just look at them and just say, well, they're just doing what their biology has determined?
Which, scarily enough, that is already happening with pedophiles.
Sure.
They're trying to, I guess, normalize that,
well, of course,
in a sense, right? We do see that coming up.
Well, that's the nature of progressivism, is that we always have to progress towards more accepting, more unity, more equality, more, so.
But it's based on that argument that they're
who
products of their own biology, basically.
Yep. They're just doing, what the chemicals and the materials in their body are leading them to do. Who can say that they're wrong for doing it then, right? And of course, I'm not saying that every atheist in the world is gonna support that kind of argumentation. Of course, there's moral atheists who would come along and just say, I'm completely opposed to pedophilia, right? But why? The question is why?
What's your justification? Yeah.
Not do all atheists support pedophilia? No. I would argue that probably most of them don't. But why not? If they're just doing what the matter in motion is leading them to do, and there's no universal reason to say that's wrong, there's just a societal reason or utilitarian reason or conventional reason, if their biology just leads them in that direction, then why is it a criminal offense? Because society says so? So there's some real issues here with atheism. If there isn't a universal lawgiver who has given us a moral law, then it's just a bunch of squishy robots, as you put it, fizzing differently. And why does one group have the right to tell another group that they're wrong, or that they're unrighteous, or that they're sinning? The concept of sinning or criminal acts is, again, based in oughtness. There's a way we ought to be, and then there's a way we ought not be. Well, who determines this? Again, convention?
Yep.
Real problems there, in maintaining a morality without a moral law.
Yeah. A couple more here. What about truth? Truth itself. The idea that I can say that something is true or false. Again, this is all in the same vein, the same line of argumentation.
Why can't you just let me have my truth?
Oh, you can have your truth. Wrong truth. I believe in truth over facts, Bunjee. Okay?
Well, so this gets back to the transcendental argument, right?
Yeah.
Ultimately, this takes us to the transcendental argument that, without a
foundation of...
Yeah, so without a God to give us universal laws of logic, then at the end of the day, there can be no truth in the big concept of truth, right? The big truth.
Yeah.
No, there can't be. So when we talk about laws of logic, we're talking about the law of identification, the law of excluded middle, and the law of non-contradiction. And so all of this dials into the correspondence theory of truth, right? That the way things really are ought to correspond to truth. Or in other words, when I think about reality, those thoughts ought to correspond to the way things really are. Mm-hmm. So, when we get into truth then, or truth claims, or when we begin to try to identify what is true, we have to have these foundations of intelligibility, or first principles of intelligibility. And these would be immaterial laws that would govern everyone everywhere.
Right.
Well, where would immaterial, universal laws of thought come from, if not from a universal or a mind beyond the universe? Because laws of thought aren't going to come from matter, and they're not material, they're immaterial, so it's not chemical.
And they're universal.
And they're universal, meaning that it has to come from beyond the universe. So right there you have laws of thought that are immaterial, that are universally binding, and determine what is truth and what is error, in the fact that if it's not logical or reasonable, then it doesn't line up with the way things really are. How could our universe function in such a way unless there is a infinite mind to give us laws of thought? So in an atheist world, we shouldn't expect that everyone would use the same laws of logic. And the reason I say this is because the chemical reactions happening in your brain and the chemical reactions happening in my brain aren't exactly the same, right? And if laws of logic come from the chemical reactions in the brain and they're not immaterial, then the laws of logic that you use wouldn't necessarily be the same laws of logic that I use. And therefore, you could have your truth, I could have my truth, but they wouldn't necessarily line up, and so therefore there could be no real truth.
Yeah.
But that's not the way it works. As a matter of fact, even if there's an atheist watching our program right now, they're attempting to pick apart every argument using laws of logic, assuming that we might be using the same laws of logic. Mm-hmm. And if we're not using the same laws of logic, then they would call foul and say, you need to use logic in order to think properly. Oh, there's a way we ought to think. There's a way that you expect me to think, though if materialism is true, then the laws of logic you're using just come from the chemical reactions in your brain, and the laws of logic that I'm using just come from the chemical reactions in my brain, and why do you think that your laws of logic are better than mine?
Yeah.
What they're really showing you, they're smuggling in this idea that there are universal laws of thought. That these are the preconditions of intelligibility that we must abide by in order to think properly.
Yeah.
But they're just smuggling in theism.
Yeah, and to take it a step further, right? We need those principles in place to do the kind of exploration that we do, scientific exploration, right? So the fact that we can reason about with each other, but also we can reason about within this world that we're in. When we look out into the stars, it's funny how we take a lot of these things for granted. Just the very basic laws of thought, the laws of logic, we kind of just assume, and we're over here doing, making discoveries and doing exploration and jotting down calculations and whatnot. But those stable laws and universal laws of logic allow us to now look out into the grand universe and sort of expect certain things.
Right.
Now, when we look out, it's, this also goes into the uniformity principle, right? That what we see out there, I can sort of trust that I can go to sleep and come back and it's the same sort of behavior. The scientific, the physical constants that govern this universe, the laws of gravity, the electromagnetic force, the force within molecules, the strong nuclear force and weak nuclear force, and all those, the fundamental physical laws that we abide by, those need to be in place, and they need to be consistent throughout all time in order to allow us to do the scientific exploration that we've been doing for the last a few thousand years. But for the atheists, again, if all these things are not, if they're just material, there's no guarantee that we would have trust in the consistency, the uniformity that we see in nature. Not just reasoning, but in the exploration that we're doing. We wouldn't have any trust in it. And so hopefully, again, if there's an atheist out there, they're trying to look for holes here, ultimately you do have to get back to the source. The things that we've been taking for granted throughout this entire conversation have been the immaterial, universal, binding laws of logic.
And this like you're saying, takes us into the realm of natural laws, right? So we've talked about moral laws, we've talked about laws of logic, laws of thought. Now we're dealing with natural laws. If atheism is true, we shouldn't expect that the natural laws as they are today ought to be the same tomorrow. So scientific discovery is based on observation and experimentation and repeatable tests and until you can start making predictions about how you expect things to go in this area of your research, right? And a lot of this is based on scientific constants, right? So we see that there's a certain decay rate, for this element, and so we can do a test here. We can, how much of this element is here? What did it decay from? What's the parent element, and what's the daughter, and how much of the daughter is there, and how much of the parent, and so we start doing these tests to kind of find out how long this thing's been decaying, or what have you, right? Or we have this speed of light, and we understand how to test this, and so we look at the starlight, and we try to make a determination about how large the universe is. Based on the red shifts and the blue shifts and all this. So we're engaging in this science, assuming that the way things are today have been going on this way in the history of the world. Well, why? Why would you assume that? Why wouldn't you assume that the periodic table of elements that we've cataloged here in our time period weren't different elements 100,000 years ago? Mm-hmm. How could you know? They might have been something else, and all these elements evolved into what we have today. Who could say? So, scientific research is based on the belief that the natural laws are constant, testable, observable, repeatable, and they're going to continue tomorrow. If gravity, if there's no reason to think that gravity is going to work the same tomorrow, that the natural laws are just kind of willy-nilly and could change on a dime, right? Well, there's no reason to build, any $1 million property, on the beach, right? So, all this just to say that in an atheistic universe, we shouldn't expect things to be constant. The only constant that we should expect is that things are always evolving. Mm-hmm. If nothing blew up and became everything through a process of evolution, then why don't we act like everything might evolve tomorrow in a way that would be less than conducive for our society today? Mm-hmm. And so, let's maybe not be as concrete in the plans that we're making today, right? But we don't function like that. We as a society, atheists included, function with the belief that the natural laws are going to be the same tomorrow. And scientists make predictions based on that information. So doesn't that imply that there's natural laws that were put in motion that we believe are solid and secure and can be counted on? Yeah. And why would that be unless there is a creator who designed it in this way?
Yeah, very good point. We did do a past episode on this. It might have been the use and abuse of science one, where right. we argued essentially that it is because of this assumption that there is order and stability within the laws that govern the universe, and this could only come out of a Christian framework, way of thinking. And so no surprise there, but that's how modern scientific research rose in history, was Christians devout Christians who were more theologians. They were called natural philosophers back then, but they were the ones that saw, we believe in a God of order who must have created this universe with a purpose, with design intended. It is our job to then discover, to know him more, and we do that by researching and discovering and applying the scientific, what eventually became known as the scientific method. But they had that framework in place. Under atheism, like you're saying, much like biological evolution is a reality, chemical evolution is a reality as well, if atheism is true.
Right.
And so that's the framework that needs to be discussed as well.
So to sum all that up, basically the only way that we would have a basis for science is if there is a God who has designed the universe to function in an orderly way that we can test and observe and engage in good science, using the scientific method, I should say. But if atheism is true, then we really don't have a basis for engaging in the scientific method. And so once again, if atheism, and going back to the question, what if atheism were the case, what would we expect to find? Well, we would expect to find things evolving in such a way, that science would be extremely difficult to engage in.
Just a tad bit. Not extremely difficult, yes. Very good. I want to pause here, and I want to remind you guys that are watching, thank you for tuning in. You're watching Studio 118. We're talking on the topic of atheism, having a really good discussion so far. If you're streaming from YouTube, we invite you to engage on the live chat. We have a Q&A portion coming up soon. So if you have any questions, submit them there through the live chat. Or if you're watching on Austin Cable Access Channel 11, hello to the one person. We invite you to call in your question to 512-576-5433. Again, we do want to mention that we're here at Calvary South Austin. We meet on Sunday mornings at 9:15 and 11:15 a.m. and also on Wednesday evenings at 7 p.m. If you have any more questions about how we do church here and more about the meeting times and whatnot, feel free to call us at 512-576-5433. All right, continuing on with our discussion on atheism, we just finished talking about the implications, and there's a great number of them. If atheism is true, if it's the case that there is no God, what would we expect the world to look like? So we had a really good discussion on that. Now I want to shift gears here and talk about what have been the more popular kind of pop arguments for atheism that we see floating around. Not necessarily the strongest arguments for atheism, but the more popular ones that we see just popping up, within society and whatnot. And there's three of them, and they really come from what, at least three of what they were deemed the four horsemen of atheism.
Yes.
So there's four horsemen. There were Richard Dawkins, there was Sam Harris, there's Christopher Hitchens, and there's one missing that we're not going to speak on today, or maybe we could if we have time, but his name is Daniel Dennett. So these guys, they were just kind of crowned the four horsemen of atheism, and they kind of rose to popularity after a lot of people kind of agree that it came after the 9/11, the attacks on the Twin Towers, and that's soon after that, or a couple years after that, Richard Dawkins came out with his book, The God Delusion. Sam Harris then followed up. His book was called The End of Faith, I believe, or Letter to a Christian Nation was another one. Christopher Hitchens, a British fellow who recently passed away from throat cancer, but he had written a book called God is Not Great, Why Religion Poisons Everything. Not so subtle. And then Daniel Dennett. I'm forgetting the name of his book. It was a thick one, but his was basically about there is no free will, essentially. But we're talking about the first three, Dawkins, Harris, and Hitchens, and how we've seen their arguments for atheism, according to them, how we've seen them just kind of spread throughout society and have really caught on with atheists, and I still see them being used today. So maybe we can kick it off with Richard Dawkins. I don't know if he's a sir. I like to call him Sir Richard Dawkins.
He sounded like a sir.
Yeah, he sounds like a sir. He looks like a sir, too. Can I say that?
Did you say Zer?
Yeah, that's right. So it's interesting. So in the God Delusion, which maybe a little side point here, if you're Christian, and you're really interested in engaging with atheists, I would definitely encourage you get familiar with the arguments that are being put out there. Read some of the books that these people are putting out. Although I would put a caveat also is that I would want to make sure that you know your theology. Get to know your own theology and get grounded in that before you start seriously engaging with other worldviews. It's definitely harder to attack another worldview when you have trouble defending your own. So I would add that caveat. But anyways, Richard Dawkins' God delusion, it seems that his main argument came down to kind of these 6 propositions. I won't read them all, but you can do that from homework if you'd like. But essentially what it came down to was he is mostly convinced that there is no God on the basis that we see what seems to be design in the universe, whether it be biological entities or even stellar entities. There seems to be design. That's the way he puts it. We have this inclination to believe that there must be a designer, and we call that designer God. So we have this strong inclination to say that, well, there must be a designer. And he says, well, we just don't know much about physics right now. Give us time. But the most important proposition that he puts forth is also the big thing that you run into if you're going to say that God is the designer, you're still stuck with the question, well, who designed God? And after putting forth those arguments, he says, therefore, we can almost be certain there is no God. So it really came down to the question, who designed the designer?
It really is. Where did God come from?
Yes.
Which is, basically a question that most kids at the age of, 5?
Yeah.
want to know, who made God? Where did God come from?
And who designed the designer? Is that a knockdown argument?
No. No. It comes back to, first of all, there has to be an infinite something. Mm-hmm. Right?
So, yeah, let's expound on that a little bit.
There has to be an infinite something. And it's not this sentence.
Nice.
So, because something exists, then there has to be an infinite cause that caused existence, right? Or the existence of finite,
Yeah, we're contingent.
Things. Right.
We didn't have to be.
Right. So, getting into contingent beings versus necessary beings, yeah. Right? Because there are contingent beings, there has to be a necessary being.
Yes.
Right? So, then when we ask the question, where did the infinite being come from? Well, it's not even a real question. It's not a real question, and the reason why is because an infinite being has always been.
By definition.
Yeah. And there, an infinite being exists apart from time, apart from matter, apart from, anything that we could probably even imagine. There's this infinite being who just is. That's why God refers to himself as I am. Mm-hmm. Or I will be what I am, right? Or I am that I am. So this infinite being is the first cause, or the uncaused causer, right? Or the uncreated creator. So, someone like Dawkins, who might make the argument that, well, matter's always existed, matter's infinite, and so there was positive, negative, what have you, as before this, and that's nothing, a bunch of negative ones and positive ones, and it cancels each other out, and therefore it's zero. It's ridiculous. Listen, if that is infinite, then we would have never arrived at today. Mm-hmm. So if the universe or matter or something other than God is the infinite thing that caused us, we would have never arrived at today. And the reason why is because we can't get far enough back into eternity past to find the beginning of all of that to arrive at today, because you can't traverse an infinite. Mm-hmm. Right? Infinite is apart from time. Time is a creation of the infinite. Right? Moments are a creation of the infinite. Meter, all of this is part of creation. The concept that we can get our minds to even grasp an infinite being without him just revealing himself to us that's mind-boggling in and of itself, right? But when we consider that something exists, contingent beings, unnecessary beings exist in an unnecessary universe that clearly has a beginning, then there must be an infinite cause, an uncreated creator who created everything that is unnecessary or contingent, right? So with that, then, when he asks, who designed the designer, what he's failing to grasp in that question is that an infinite designer needs no designer.
Yeah.
You have to end up somewhere with an infinite being, and an infinite being always has been.
Yeah. I get I see always the force, right, is that he's basically saying who created the creator, who designed the designer. I get that. And it's funny that, these arguments are not new. That's the funny thing, is that if he were even remotely familiar with Thomas Aquinas, right, who has the Aquinas' 5 ways, who talked about the uncaused cause, because we see things in motion. And if we just rewind the tape, there has to be a stopping point. There has to be an uncaused cause, the first mover, right? The primary mover.
Yes.
These arguments are centuries old.
Yes.
And it was just flabbergasting that to see Dawkins just completely ignorant of the basic historical argument that's being made, right?
He's been so busy on that horse.
Yes, Sir Richard Dawkins. And it's funny because I see an even easier way to debunk this is, think about when you notice design, right? When you notice a famous artwork, an art piece, right? Do you say, well, I'm not familiar with this artwork. I don't know who designed it, but I know it's designed. Would Richard Dawkins then come across and say, if you don't know who designed it, who designed the designer, you can't say that's design. What? I know that's clearly design. I don't need to know anything about the designer, the name, or whether it's a man or a woman, but I do know how to detect design in nature.
This is a beautiful, Leonardo da Vinci drawing here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but who was his parents?
Yeah. I guess he doesn't exist. I guess he didn't do any of those things, right?
When we consider unnecessary beings, it's like, so I came from my parents, they came from their parents, and we can keep going backwards, right? But we have to end up at a beginning, and the reason why is because we arrived at today. We are not existing in the infinite.
Right.
We are existing within created time. Mm-hmm. By an infinite being.
Yeah.
And so the question, well, who created the infinite being, or who designed the designer? It's basically a confusion of categories.
Yes.
Right? It's categorical confusion to think that an infinite being needs a creator or a designer. It all has to end up with an infinite being.
Yeah.
Number one, because there is being, therefore we must come from a being. Mm-hmm. Number two, because we are beings with mind, that there must be an infinite being with a mind, mm-hmm. right? And then three, because the finite exists, then there must be an infinite being who is immaterial that must exist. Because if this infinite being is made up of matter, then his matter would occupy all space everywhere. Mm-hmm. So there must be, just based on our existence, we can know that there must be an infinite, invisible, immaterial being with a mind.
Yeah.
And then we can begin to look at the attributes of man and realize that we're not greater than our creator. Therefore, our sense of justice, our sense of morality, our sense of and we can begin to take those attributes of man and backtrack into what God might be like, right? And then we can ask, well, how does this line up with the different gods that, claim to be our creator? And then from that, we can arrive at the conclusion that the God of the Bible is the only one that actually lines up in the way that we should expect.
Yep. Very good. Sir Richard Dawkins, I'm sorry to tell you, not a good argument.
You bit, son.
You're done. So that leads us then to Sam Harris. He actually wrote a book beyond Letter to a Christian Nation and The End of Faith, and he wrote a book called Moral Landscape. And this was his attempt. I think he's a neuroscientist, or used to be rather. So he was trying to explain how we can justify objective morality under atheism. So that's important, objective morality, because typically, as we've been talking about with atheism, you're left with, at the very least, or at the very most, subjective morality by convention, right? But he's arguing, he's acknowledging, no, there's objective morality, and he's very societally conscious. So he brings up examples of, like, we know that when women are being violated in other countries, we don't have to have a debate on whether these things are right or wrong, or how wrong are they. We know they're objectively wrong. But he's an atheist as well. So he's trying to use his framework in order to develop a system that doesn't need God as the basis to say we can have objective morality. And so he said that there's this moral landscape, essentially, that we have to think about. There's peaks and there's valleys, and there's flourishing and there's suffering, essentially, in the world. And his main argument, ultimately, is that he defines good as the flourishing of human beings. So I want you to understand the significance of this. As an atheist, he gets around the question of, because he knows inevitably the question is going to come, well, how do you know what's good? How do you know that the flourishing of human beings is a good thing, a morally good thing? So what he does, rather than, is just define good as the flourishing of human beings. But hopefully, if you've been paying attention throughout our discussion, under atheism, there's no reason to even believe that the flourishing of anything, much less human beings, has to be the objective standpoint. Why not the flourishing of ants? They've been here longer than we have. Why not the flourishing of Neanderthals, or anything that is different than the human race? But he says objective morality is actually rooted in the flourishing of human beings. So he's just kind of defined away any objection. It's basically non-falsifiable.
Right.
And so with Sam Harris, though, that's his trick that he uses, is just to define his conclusion, essentially. He's begging the question at this point. So don't fall for that. If there's an atheist out there who is trying to tell you that we can root morality in what science tells us, that if something is painful, that is wrong, not necessarily. He's just defining that as wrong and certain things as good. Need to be pushed back on that.
And the real argument is, says who?
Exactly, yeah.
Says who? Says you? Why do you get to say? You're not my real dad.
Sam Harris. Always getting somebody's business. And it's funny, Richard Dawkins, when he wrote, I think it was In the Selfish Gene, a book he wrote in the 1970s, this is one of his quotes. There is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pointless indifference. We are machines for propagating DNA. It is every living object's sole reason for being. This is part of atheism. That falls right in line with atheism. So rather than atheism succeeding at, usurping the worldview of Christianity and saying, oh, no, we have the real answer for why there is objective morality. No, you don't.
So if the main purpose is to propagate human DNA, what's wrong with rape?
Yep.
Now, I'm completely opposed to rape, and all for a judicial system that punishes every rapist. But under the system of atheism, if the belief is that the best thing that we can do is make sure that the human race continues to exist, what's wrong with rape? Why is it wrong?
Yeah. I have heard, evolutionary arguments that basically say there are some in the herd that choose to go against their own self-interest, but it's more for the betterment of the entire population, right? So you will always have those kind of, those on the fringes that will sacrifice themselves, but what winds up happening is that their kind or their type still flourishes. But understand, is this how we're defining right and wrong?
Yep.
What is good for the herd?
Yep.
What is good for the propagation of a certain kind of species? Again, number one, you still have to deal with the fact, why our species? Why Homo sapiens? Why not other animal types? Why not anything else? But is this really what we want to get into, is that we say that rape is wrong simply because it is not good for the community as a whole? Is that really the kind of reasoning that we want to use?
But again, if propagation of DNA is the ultimate goal, then is that more important than protecting women? And again, of course, backing out of all that, I would just say, well, most certainly. I mean, we look at the scriptures, we recognize that, there is something that the Lord has identified as sexual immorality, and that this is not God's will for us. And so, I can make a Christian case against rape, no problem. It would be easy to show that every rapist should be punished, right? But in an atheistic worldview, if the propagation of DNA is the ultimate goal, then doesn't that override any other morality?
Yep. And another issue here is that the fact that he's trying to use science, as it were, to ground objective morality. Because basically he says that through science, we can show things that are painful and what causes flourishing. Whenever we do a science experiment and say, does that cause joy or does that cause suffering? He's using science to say, we know science shows us what's objectively good or what's objectively bad, but that's not the case, right? Science doesn't work that way. We did a whole episode on that. There's a philosopher that has a quote on this. Science is about facts, not norms. It might tell us how we are, but it wouldn't tell us what is wrong with how we are. Once you start talking about, sure, you can. The famous example I see thrown around is science told us how to build the atomic bomb. Science cannot tell us whether using that bomb is moral or not.
Yeah.
That's not in the domain of science. You need to talk philosophy. You need to talk ethics at that point.
Yeah, which gets back to a point that Dr. Greg Bonson was making about questions about evidence, and our questions about evidence all answered in the same sort of way. And he referred to one atheistic problem is that they engage in what he called the box of crackers in the pantry fallacy. Which is that atheists tend to try to answer all questions in the same way of, is there a box of crackers in the pantry? Well, go open the door and look and see, right? And if not, then no, right? But that's not the way that you examine every question or arrive at an answer. For example, how can I prove that the scientific method is the best way to answer all questions? Would I use the scientific method to prove that? And if so, am I not engaging in circular reasoning?
Yeah.
And I mean, we could just go on and on and on with something that we probably don't have time for. But point being, though, that we don't use the scientific method to answer questions about yesterday.
Yep.
Right? Did Jesus Christ rise from the grave? Well, that's not a question that science can answer.
It's not repeatable.
Science can say that people don't normally rise from the grave. That, excuse me, that is a scientific observation, but that doesn't answer the question, did a miracle happen back in the first century, right?
Yeah.
So atheists would do well to be humble about those three spheres of knowledge that I identified earlier on, that there's the known knowns, the known unknowns, and there's all these unknown unknowns that we would do well to be humble enough to realize that, sometimes that information will be discovered scientifically, but sometimes it'll be discovered supernaturally.
Yeah, very good point. So that's Sam Harris, rather. With the time remaining, at least for the live stream for cable access, we can just quickly deal with Christopher Hitchens. Should be easy.
He's wrong.
Because what happens here essentially is that Christopher Hitchens does not, in his book, God is Not Great, Why Religion Poisons Everything, he doesn't put forth any arguments. Any real arguments.
Yeah, I was about to say.
His book is really just...
He argues a lot.
Yes. It's really just a giant book of complaints against wrong things that have happened from religious people or religious systems. And for the most part, I would be like, yeah, I'm right there with you, Hitchens. I don't appreciate a lot of the abuses of religion that have happened throughout history.
Yep.
There are certain claims that he makes, like, for instance, just the mere religious doctrine, teaching children religious doctrine is, akin to child abuse. Obviously, that's not the case. We all, as parents, we're all going to inform our kids of one philosophy, one worldview, or another. So, but essentially, Christopher Hitchens, if you ever read his book, it is just a giant book of complaints. You were going to talk about...
well, his point is that, a bunch of
history.
Christians did a bunch of bad things.
Yeah.
Therefore, don't believe in Jesus. Well, we don't judge Jesus based on what Christians do in his name. Judge Jesus based on what he taught, and then, is there evidence to believe in the physical resurrection of our Lord and Savior? And I believe that, yes, there's plenty of evidence to believe in the physical resurrection of Jesus Christ. So believe in Jesus because of what Jesus did and the evidence that supports all of that. But if you're going to dismiss Christianity because there's been a bunch of jerky Christians in church history, well, then you got to also reject atheism, because there's been some jerky atheists, in human history. Napoleon Bonaparte, brought about the death of 6 million Europeans and just completely decimated the economics of France. Mussolini, just to keep it short here, Mussolini was just a notorious fascist, supported Hitler in his conquest of Austria, invaded Ethiopia, used poison gas, bombed the Red Cross hospitals, concentration camps, so on and so forth. He ordered the execution of prisoners without trial. Just on and on and on. Mussolini was a horrible man and just committed atheist, right? Mao Zedong led the Communist Party of China to victory. Under his insane rule, it was basically anarchy, a form of anarchy. But in his great leap forward, he triggered a catastrophic and massive famine, which killed a bunch of people, and he's been blamed for the death of about 20 to 67 million of his own comrades. And so, we could just go on with a list of atheists who have also done horrible things. So if Dawkins' argument, is... did I say Dawkins? Yeah, Hitchens.
Hitchens, yeah.
Yeah. So if Hitchens' argument, is that Christianity is false because there's been horrible Christians in church history, well, the same argument applies to atheism.
Yep. Just like that.
Boom.
Hitchens destroyed. I want to pause right here. We are actually going to cut off the stream to cable access channel 11 in just a bit, but I invite you, if you are watching on channel 11, join us on the YouTube channel, youtube.com/Calvary South Austin. We're going to continue the live stream for just a bit because we're going to enter into our Q&A portion, and so I invite you to jump onto that stream. We're going to continue in a bit. There's going to be some B-roll rolling right now, and we'll visit you on the other side.
What'd you call me?
Thanks. Nice. All right. Welcome back on YouTube. We just finished talking about the kind of pop arguments from atheism, and we've, I think, easily debunked them. We talked about Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, and Christopher Hitchens, and I think that really just concludes our discussion on atheism. We're going to enter into our Q&A portion, but just want to summarize what we've talked about so far. We started off with the kind of shifting definition of atheism, as it's more modernly known as kind of hard agnosticism. And so the encouragement there is, if you ever come across a person who is an atheist or agnostic, just ask them what they actually believe, and that'll help you understand where they're coming from. We also talked about the implications of atheism. If there is no God, what would we expect the world to look like? And we showed that it doesn't look anything like what we see now. And so that gives us good reason to believe that atheism is not true, that there is a God. And truly, with morality, with truth, with cosmic purpose in this world, there's good reasons to believe in theism over atheism. And then we brought up some of the pop arguments we just discussed from Richard Dawkins, his main argument in The God Delusion, and Sam Harris's argument in The Moral Landscape, and Christopher Hitchens' ramblings in his book. We showed that they really had
ad hominem
attacks,
really
just complaints. And they really do not bring forth strong arguments for atheism. Now, like I said, they aren't the strongest, but that's what we see still kind of surviving throughout the atheistic communities. But there are some stronger ones, which we may tackle in a different episode. So that's our discussion on atheism. But now we have some questions which kind of just carry on more of these are questions that we typically hear atheists bring up in our conversations with them, and we'd like to discuss some of those now. But again, if you have questions of your own, feed them into the live chat, call them in, and hopefully we can get to them. So first one that we typically hear thrown around is, I believe, well, we're all atheists, right? We're all atheists, if you didn't know. I just believe in one less God than you do.
Yeah.
We all don't believe that Zeus or the other Greek gods exist. I don't either. But I just so happen to believe in one less God than you.
Yeah.
We're all atheists.
Yeah.
Yeah, this it's funny. It's funny when I hear this. But again, we got to go back to what is the definition of atheism, right?
What is it?
It is there is no God.
So we're all atheists.
Yes.
And by that, what I think the arguer intends to communicate is that you're rejecting a bunch of gods too.
Yeah.
I just reject one more than you.
Of course, yeah.
Right. But they're dismissing the very concept of what a theist is while simultaneously dismissing the concept of what an atheist is. Mm-hmm. So not only are they probably embracing the more modern definition of atheism, which is the idea that, well, I just don't have a reason to believe in God. You haven't given me any real evidence to prove God, so therefore I just can't believe that there is a God, right? So that's the more modern take on atheism. So not only does this atheist dismiss the classical definition of atheism, or the atheist who says there is no God, and then is unable to defend that, right? Not only are they just disregarding the classical definition of an atheist, but they're also disregarding in the same argument the classical definition of a theist. Mm-hmm. Because a theist is someone who says there is a God. And so when they say, well, you're an atheist too, you just believe one more God than I believe, or I reject one more God than you're rejecting. Yeah. You've completely glazed over the very thing that separates me as a theist from you as an atheist. Yeah. Right? I believe in a God, therefore I'm a theist, right? I heard another apologist explain it like this. It's like a married guy hanging out with a bunch of bachelors and saying, I'm a bachelor too. I'm just married to one more woman than you guys.
Yes. Yes, classic. Yeah.
It's just kind of like, come on, no.
Yeah.
I'm a pet owner too,
Yes. Nice.
I just don't have one dog that you have.
Yeah. Yeah, and that
is ridiculous.
And you could also get into how do we define God, right? Mm. Because I get it that the atheist is trying to say, well, I'm rejecting all sorts of gods, but you really have to deal with what has historically been understood as God. And I'm talking about big G. Not these little g Greek, mythology gods, but big G God. And that is the ultimate being. What grounds reality, what grounds truth, what grounds logic, and all that. Yep. That is what we're after. So we can talk about that too. But yeah, this I believe in one less God than you do. It's more of a distraction, more of a red herring. Probably something to just trip you up and say, I don't have time to deal with you. But hopefully now you're armed with some good response there. Another question here that we typically hear in our conversations is, well, extraordinary claims demand extraordinary evidence.
And with great power comes great responsibility.
I'm Batman. So yes, what's the force behind this? And what I usually hear in the context here is that, well, you're trying to convince me of something that's, if it's true, it's going to completely change my lifestyle, essentially, my worldview. That's a big claim you're making. You're saying there's a God that created all of this, and you better have some really good evidence to convince me of that, right? So extraordinary claims demand extraordinary evidence. And I think we actually tackled this probably in a different episode, but it's worth bringing up here for atheism.
And
go ahead.
I would just appeal to what Paul wrote in Romans chapter 1. So he says here in Romans 1 that the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. According to Paul, the atheist is suppressing truth in unrighteousness, right? And the reason why is because the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men. So in other words, there's a revelation that you see even in the heavens that God exists. And then Paul continues, because what may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. And then in chapter 2, he goes on to tell us that the law is written upon our hearts. So that's what he's referring to there. For since the creation of the world, Paul says, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. In other words, the atheist is without excuse for their rejection of God. Paul continues, although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools, and changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like corruptible man, and birds, and four-footed animals, and creeping things. Or in other words, they start worshiping the creation rather than the creator. So when we consider what Paul is saying here, he's saying that the atheist is without excuse for their rejection of God, because it is, the creation itself is so evidential. It's, how would you explain a universe like the one we exist in apart from there being an infinite creator who is the first uncaused causer or uncreated creator, right, or unmoved mover? So, when it comes to this question, I would just appeal to the extraordinary universe that we exist in, and the very fact that we could sit down, use the same laws of logic, though the chemicals in our brains are doing different things, and yet we could sit down and have a rational discussion about evidence, about uniformity, about all of these sorts of things, and understand one another, and we have the same laws of logic, and all of this to me is extraordinary evidence that there must be a God. The heavens declare his glory, right? The stars reveal his handiwork. The creation reveals, the evidence that there is a creator. And I would even take it, a little bit down to a smaller level and just point to the Fibonacci sequence, which we find within, the created order of even our planet. Whether we're talking about spiral galaxies or whether we're talking about pine cones and sunflowers, or conch shells, or we see this same Fibonacci sequence. These spirals, in the largest galaxies and in the smallest, elements, we find this same exact sequence everywhere. And in my thought, it's God's thumbprint. It's God putting his fingerprint, his design on everything.
Yeah.
So, the extraordinary claim is that there is no God that made all of this. There is no designer that designed all of this. That's the extraordinary claim, that all of this is just by random chance.
Yeah.
To me, that's way more extraordinary a claim than there's a creator who created everything. There's a designer who designed everything.
Yeah, that's what I was going to point out, is that, we need to be careful with this question, because the language that's being used there is try to surprise you with oh, no, it's kind of gaslighting you, you know, that no, you're the one making extraordinary claims that, you know, no normal person would believe such claims, right? And so they're kind of trying to put your back at a wall and be like, you have to prove to me, and you have a high bar.
Yeah.
And here's where I would like to just point out and say, what are you talking about? You don't need extraordinary evidence, although this is more than enough. It is plain to see in nature for those that are willing to see it. But it doesn't need to be extraordinary is what I'm saying. It just simply needs to be what we expect to see, right? So for instance, there might be the typical example I hear is a person who wins the lotto. You know, what are the chances? 1 in whatever 100 million chances. That's very low probability. And so if a person comes and says, I won. Whoa. It's such a low probability. You better have extraordinary evidence to show me that you won this lottery. All I have is this ticket with numbers.
That's not extraordinary.
I don't know about that.
That's just an ordinary ticket.
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying is all the evidence that is needed is the evidence that is supposed to fit, that simply explains what is being proposed, right? It's not extraordinary. It's just basic evidence that fits. And so that's why I just want to stay away from the word games and just call it out and be like, look, let's not play word games.
Sure.
What do we expect to see? And like you said, it's more extraordinary to make the other claim.
And it comes back to, you know, that simple statement that I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. Right? When I look at the world around me, it's like that's why I could never take that next step from agnosticism into atheism. And there was always that, there's probably some God out there, you know, but you know, I'm still going to do my own thing, right? So that's the way I was as an unbeliever. It's like I wasn't ready to just say there is no God. I shook my fist at someone, right?
Smite me.
I mean, you know, when I gave him that, you know, I'm so angry with you. It's just like, well, I'm angry at someone. And that's what blows my mind about a lot of atheists is that they're spending a whole lot of their time arguing against what they believe to be no one. Yeah. Right.
Given that there's one life to live.
Yeah. And
we're living in the now.
Why waste the time arguing with people who believe in some fantasy God, right?
Yeah.
It reminds me of a conversation I had on the drag one time. This is about the time when episode 1 came out of Star Wars. And there hadn't been a Star Wars movie in years, right? And so episode 1's finally coming out, you know, and Lucas is going to release the first 3 episodes of the Star Wars series. And so I was on the drag witnessing to people, and the guy was going to the ATM to get some money because he was headed down to 6th Street to go party. And I stopped him and I said, hey, let me ask you a question. You know, what do you know about Jesus? And he said, hey, I'm about to go party. I don't want to talk about Jesus. You know, it's just, you know, that's not my mindset right now. And I said, okay, well, have you seen the new Star Wars? He said, no, not yet. I said, well, I have. And he goes, really? You know, so, you know, tell me about this, tell me about that. And, you know, he wanted to know all about, you know, my experience in watching, you know, episode 1. And so I shared it with him. And I said, but let me ask you this before you get on the way. Why is it that you have no problem talking, you know, about all these Star Wars characters who are fictional? But you really are uncomfortable talking about a God who you probably think is fictional too. I mean, if they're both fictional, you know, what's the big deal talking about either one? Yeah. He said, man, why can't you just respect that? I don't want to talk about it. I said, okay, I'll respect it. But all that tells me is that you know God is real. Yeah. You made that man cry. Have a good night. But, you know, you see so much anger in some of these atheists. Not all of them, of course, but, you know, some of them are very angry about God. Yeah. And why, if he doesn't exist?
I think that matches up right with, and I've been conversations with you where we've been talking to atheists, and they threw up what I call smoke screens, essentially, the more heady arguments. And once we kind of got through them all, then they brought out the real issues, which is
the moral dilemma.
Yeah. Which is typically something like, God didn't answer this prayer. My mom died when I was a kid, or I have these feelings that I can't get rid of, and why didn't God answer that, right? And it typically falls into that category. So be aware of that. You know, if you're ever in a conversation with atheists, you know, a lot of what we encounter is really, it's a an issue of the will, if you will. It's not an argument that they're fighting against. It's really the willpower.
Yeah.
And that actually leads us to a really good question here is what's the best way to witness to people who point to the God of the Old Testament and argue that they can't believe in that kind of vengeful God? That's a really good question, right? And I don't know if I don't think we've done an episode on this, have we? Or did we?
No, I mean, and that is something that is oftentimes brought up as far as, I can get with Jesus, he seems pretty cool, but
The God of the Old Testament.
the God of the Old Testament, he's so mean and so
Wrathful, vengeful.
You might read, Revelation.
Yeah.
And
It's coming.
just see that Jesus is going to come back and wage war against the nations and whatnot. But so
the assumption is that.
Well, the thing that I would go with typically, and of course, you need to be prayerful anytime you're talking with somebody, and there's the scripted answers that we can throw out there, and it's good to have several answers to any question, but most importantly, it's good to be led by the Holy Spirit as we witness and share a defense or present people with our point of view or the reason for the hope that's within us with that meekness and respect, right? But we need to be Spirit-led as we answer. But so I'm just presenting this as one option that you might use if the Spirit leads. But it's important to understand that in order to look down on the decisions that God makes, you have to have the moral authority. If you're going to say that there's a way God ought not be, he ought not punish those people. He ought not, send the Jews in to wipe out that nation of people. He ought not flood the world and destroy all living creatures except for those on the ark. He ought not send fire down on Sodom and Gomorrah. Those are all immoral acts. I can't believe in that God. Well, so if there is a God, then he is the standard of morality. And your morality is not higher than his. Your morality is not more moral than his morality. Your morality comes from his morality, right? So when people see things in the Old Testament that they don't like, and they're like, oh, how could God make this call? How could he send those people to go and destroy those people and these sorts of things, right? It's important to understand that, there are circumstances where we would think that is the right decision. For example, if, you have a group of people who are so wicked that they are, offering their children up to a false god, throwing their babies into fires, and engaging in all manner of sexual immorality that God is displeased with. And then he chooses in the process to give these people opportunities to repent, but they reject those opportunities to repent, and they continue to get worse and worse and worse to the point where they're infected with all kinds of, venereal diseases that threatens to end the human race. Well, what are you going to do with those people? Or let's bring it home. You've got 2 little boys at home, right? And if you woke up and found that a group of people had broken into your house with the intention of kidnapping your boys, what would you do? Wouldn't you become a vengeful father at that point? Wouldn't you take every necessary measure to stop those people from carrying your kids away? I mean, of course. Yeah. So we also see the God of the Bible, sending Jonah to go and warn the Ninevites that if they don't repent, they're going to be destroyed. And in that story, we see God's, plan for providing people with opportunities to repent. And thankfully for them, Jonah went, he proclaimed the warning of God. They heard it, they repented, and God relented of the destruction that he was going to pour out upon them, right? So when we see the stories in the Old Testament about this vengeful God who is destroying these nations and pouring down fire and flooding the world and these sorts of things, we have to remember, number one, that he is the standard of morality. Our morality is not better than his. Therefore, he must have some righteous reason for the wrath that he pours out on a wicked people.
Yeah, and I was going to mention also that one thing to understand in the Old Testament also is that God dealt with the nation of Israel, whom he calls the apple of his eye. He dealt with them the most harshly.
Yeah.
They continued to disobey him and go against his explicit commandments. He gave them over into slavery. He allowed them to be defeated in battle many, many times. He punished them with plagues even.
Yeah.
And this he did more often than what he did with the surrounding nations. With the surrounding nations, and it's important to get the context, of course, is that we do see that he was abundantly patient with them.
Yes.
Hundreds of years of patience, and explicitly saying their cup is almost full, right? And now then comes the judgment. It's not a wrath that is unjustified. It's not one of those gut reaction that you just kind of, you're mad and then you go and do something stupid. No, this was hundreds of years, centuries of patience that built up and plenty of opportunities to repent. And then came the judgment. And that goes alongside with what Bunjee was also talking about, is that God is the source of morality. If he has a reason to do so, then that reason is a moral reason, because it's coming from the standard of morality. So we can't forget about that. And as you mentioned also, read Revelation. There's some stuff that's coming up. I don't want to spoil it for you, but... All right, so very good question. Whoever asked that, appreciate it. Here's another question. We'll take a couple more, then we'll close out here. But another one is, when defending Christianity, when speaking with an agnostic or atheist, where does rationalism end and faith begin? And then referencing Proverbs 9:10. Where does rationalism end and faith begin? Very good question.
So, Proverbs 9:10 says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. Mm-hmm. And, I would probably approach this question with a little bit of background in, pre-evangelism, and the helping people to recognize that their worldview is insufficient. Mm-hmm. So everybody's standing on a foundation that's made up of the various building blocks, beliefs, and they think that they're standing on solid foundation, right? And they have their reasons or their rationale for why this is the right foundation for them to stand on, right? If I come along and I say, yeah, but you ought to believe in Jesus, and they go, no, thanks, I've got my foundation. Should I just say, yeah, but, unless you fear the God of the Bible, you're not going to really have any wisdom to recognize that you're standing on the wrong foundation, mm-hmm. right? Most people would just,
okay,
have a great day, Whereas if you come along and you start removing their building blocks, mm-hmm. belief by belief, showing them why this isn't rational, that's not logical, this doesn't line up, right? And you begin to cause them to examine the foundation that they're standing on, then they begin to replace those building blocks, because now you're on a shaky foundation, mm-hmm. and the rational mind is, I need to stand on a solid foundation, something that makes sense, something that I can go to sleep and be comfortable with, right? So as we begin to help them to understand that there are better beliefs, that there are more rational beliefs, God says, come now, let's reason together. Though your sins are like scarlet, they shall be as wool. The concept there being that a proper use of reason will lead someone to understand that they're stained with sin and that Jesus is the one who can cleanse those sins. So mm-hmm. I think that rationality has to be a part of our evangelistic endeavor. I don't think that there's a point where we give up rationalism, and just tell people just to believe. Because faith is based on let me think of the right way to put it. So I think about doubting Thomas, mm-hmm. which I would rather call him skeptical Thomas, right? But as a skeptic, he's saying, hey, I'm not going to believe until I see reason to believe. And Jesus comes along and says, Thomas, you're horrible. You're never going to believe, because you're just supposed to believe by faith. No, Jesus comes along and says, hey, examine the wounds. Check me out. Mm-hmm. And so we see in that Jesus totally fine with skepticism, even, to some degree, applauding it, rewarding it, and saying, check me out. Mm-hmm. And then goes on to say, blessed are those who, having not seen, still believe, right? But that's not to say that we shouldn't give them reasonable arguments to believe. Yep. Peter even tells us, Paul even tells us that we are to engage in apologetics as we defend our faith. Well, in what way? Paul also tells us that we are to tear down arguments and every high and lofty thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of Jesus Christ. So in all of this, all that is to say that we should engage in evangelistic endeavors in a very reasonable way as we provide reasons for the faith that we've embraced so that they too might also embrace that same faith. Whereas what Solomon is saying here in Proverbs 9 is that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is understanding, right? And I think that's good advice for Christians who want to grow in their faith. Whereas, as an evangelistic verse, I would more appeal to, come now, let's reason together. Though your sins are like scarlet, they shall be as wool. A proper use of reasoning is going to lead someone to understand their need for Jesus.
Yeah. Yeah, we can see two extremes in the church, right? One is what you were talking about, the reliance solely on faith, the fideism is, no, stay away from the arguments. You don't need to worry about trying to defend your faith. What's the illustration they use is, the truth is like a lion.
Let it out of the cage.
Let it out of the cage, yeah. It'll do its work, right? And that's the kind of conversation they have. It's like, you just need to trust in Jesus. Why don't you trust in Jesus? I don't see any evidence.
But Jesus loves you.
Yeah, that kind of stuff.
Jesus loves you.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Bing. So that's the kind of fideism where it's the total reliance upon, it's not even faith, like you said. That's not faith correctly applied. Faith is trust. It's trusting that, I do see that there is something to stand on. There's something there that I can grip and hold on to fastly, and that is what I'm going to commit my life to. And on the other extreme is the rationalism. The one that is the probably a younger person who thinks that apologetic arguments are
I'm going to argue the only way into the kingdom, and
that's not what we see. We see Paul. He says, "I'm not ashamed of Romans 1:16. I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for that is the power to salvation." Right.
And back to the questioner, there is a distinct separation between intellectual belief and saving faith. Mm. And so if I understand the question in that light, we do need to encourage people to take a step of faith in, or to rest, if you will, in the finished work of Jesus Christ. Mm-hmm. I myself was an intellectual believer maybe for almost a month before I became a Christian. Mm-hmm. There was about a month that I had been convinced that Jesus Christ rose from the grave, that he died on the cross for my sins, that all of this in the gospel is true. I was convinced for, like I said, maybe about a month before I actually repented and believed in Jesus Christ and received the forgiveness of sins, right? So we don't want to lead people to think that an intellectual belief in the facts of the gospel is saving faith. It's not. Like the devil believes all the intellectual facts about the gospel. Mm-hmm. The demons believe in God and they tremble, right? Yep. But saving faith is when you take that information and say, I'm going to rest in the finished work of Jesus Christ. That's when a conversion happens and a person is born again. So if we take the question in that sense, then we do have to bring people rationally to the foot of the cross. And as we show them the evidence for believing in a risen Lord, then we need to encourage them to take that step of faith and rest in the finished work. And that's where the wisdom of God and the understanding begins to grow as we learn to live in holy fear of him.
And I can already hear the atheist, well, faith is just a blind leap.
No.
Right?
Not for me, it wasn't.
Right.
It may be for some, and praise the Lord that he'll save a person with blind faith. A person that just blindly comes and just says, I believe in you, Jesus. I receive by faith that free gift of grace. The Lord saves them. I wasn't that person. I needed to see that there was actual reason to believe, that I wasn't just going to take a blind leap into a dark chasm and hope that Jesus is going to catch me at the bottom. I needed to see that there was good reasons to become a Christian.
Yeah.
And the reasons are there. The evidence is there. The logic, it checked out. The arguments panned out. The first, second, third century historians, that recorded this information. I mean, it was all there for me. And so for a month, I was an intellectual believer until finally I was brought to that place of just realizing that I just needed to put my life into the hands of the Lord Jesus Christ. And that's when I was saved.
Very cool. All right. I just have one more question to lead us out here. Are there any best books that you recommend on this subject, as well as defending our faith? Maybe some resources that we can point some people to that you have found helpful?
Yeah, I would point you to the Bible. That's the church answer.
Yeah. Jesus.
Yeah, I personally enjoy a reference book like Baker's Encyclopedia of Christian Apologetics. Mm-hmm. Like, that's my style of reading.
A dictionary. An encyclopedia, really.
Right. And the reason why is because I can go in to the Encyclopedia of Christian Apologetics and just take from, I can take Geisler's snippets, and summaries, and go from there. And of course, he gives his references, the books that he's appealing to or using along the way that you can go then reference yourself, and that's all great. But I tend to find, because like I get real tired of everybody's illustrations, and they have to tell their story along the way, and it's just kind of like I don't have time for that.
Yeah. It's like the reality TV shows that want to show you the whole background.
Oh, yeah.
Like, just show me the results, man.
Oh, that's NFL football, and that's the way UFC got that way. I used to love watching UFC, and then it was just kind of like, we got to tell you the entire backstory of what happened in this person's life. So, so here's this 10-minute video of this person's life, and there's a 3-minute fight. Nice. So finally, I was just kind of like, I'm done. I'm so done with this.
Get your money's worth.
Let's just get to the fights and let's move on. That's good. If we can make these shorter fights, like at the Valencia, but that's another thing. But so I've enjoyed, a handful of books on the subject. Yeah. But for the most part, I've learned more from Geisler's, it's the Baker's Encyclopedia of Christian Apologetics. You can just take topic by topic as you're going through, and you'll see him referencing his other topics, or you'll see him referencing books, and then you can go and check out the books that he's referring to. And for me, that if you're going to own one book on Christian apologetics, and you want it to cover more than even atheism and agnosticism, Baker's Encyclopedia of Christian Apologetics.
Very good.
Now, what about you?
I would have 3, and I would order them in terms of like easiest to most difficult. The first one being easiest is probably Frank Turek and Norm Geisler. I don't have enough faith to be an atheist.
It's a good one.
They take you through, kind of step by step, logically speaking, from the very existence of truth itself all the way to like the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. Second one would be Reasonable Faith by William Lane Craig. He just tackles, top arguments that show there is a God and that Christianity is true. And it's kind of like at a layperson level, but also a little bit scholarly, so that's really good. And then for more heady stuff, it's more of an encyclopedia, but it's called philosophical foundations for a Christian worldview. So
Yeah.
you can have a lot of fun there.
And I actually taught that as a textbook at Calvary Austin several years ago. And it's a tough book to get through for someone at the lay level, but it's worth it if you'll take the time to actually define terms as you go and not just glaze over some of the more difficult words to understand. If you'll take the time to actually just dig in and examine the words that he's using in their context and do that research, man, that book is gold. Yeah.
Hold on to it. Might be worth something. All right. Well, that about does it for us. This is Studio 118. We just talked about atheism. Thank you for sticking with us. Join us next month. I believe it'll be April 1st. That is not an April Fool's joke. Join us on April 1st. But for now, me and Bunjee, we are signing off. Thank you for joining us. Good night.